My name is Pablo. I'm a PhD student at Princeton. It's very nice to meet you. I'm collaborating with Jacobin both in the States and in Latin America as well. Right now I'm in Buenos Aires because of the pandemic. I just came back and I'm still here. So again, thank you very much for your time. Okay, so Anwar Shaikh is professor of economics at the Graduate Faculty of Political and Social Science of the New School University. He has a long trajectory doing research and teaching on the political economy of capitalism. He has made contributions to several fields, such as the labor theory of value, production functions, international trade, economic growth, cycles, and global economic crisis. His last book from 2016 is Capitalism, Competition, Conflict, and Crisis, and provided a great overview of his career and his work. So thank you very much for being here with us, Professor Shaikh. I don't know if you want to start with some of the questions or just address.
No, let me provide the background because
Yeah, that sounds good.
It's not true that everything I wrote is simply a kind of linear line. The book was an attempt to generate a consistent and coherent economic framework for the economic analysis as an alternative to both neoclassical economics, which is the pro-market, free market story, and post-Keynesian economics, which is the idea that markets are not perfect, that there's monopoly, and so on. My point there is that imperfection is the dual of perfection. So as soon as you begin to say the market is imperfect, then you're already taking the idea that something is perfect. And you don't need that. So the idea that I substitute for that is the idea of the real competition, real development. And I'm going to expand on that a little bit. But so we don't have to fall into the trap of thinking that the world is imperfect because it doesn't live up to a model of it which is completely bizarre. And the analysis, the analogy I use is, I went to Catholic school, by the way, in Pakistan, so this is something I'm embedded in me. You can see that in the story of the Bible, there's this idea that there was an era of perfection, which was the Garden of Eden, which is very similar, by the way, to the idea of perfect competition, only there's no competition. And then the Garden of Eden is overthrown by imperfection, which is the serpent. The serpent comes in, and so imperfection comes into the Garden of Eden. And for this reason, people are thrown out, and the real world appears then as an imperfection, as a series of imperfections, again and again and again. And this is exactly parallel to the idea of neoclassical economics as a description of a perfect capitalism and the real world as a series of imperfections. I wrote a little essay about that, and it's on my book webpage. And I've forgotten the name, but it's something about the Garden of Eden, about it's called Edenomic economics, because it talks about the parallel to the Garden of Eden, and more detailed. It's meant to be satirical. So if you are approaching this way, then you have, and I tried to show in the book is 1,000 pages. And one reason it's so big is that I want to show that this framework can confront, first of all, the empirical evidence. That's the most important thing. As Marx argues, the object of investigation is the real, not what other people have written about that object. So even though I provide criticisms of other schools of economics, they're always grounded in the fact that you have to explain in a natural way, so to speak, in a systematic way, what you see. Now, this doesn't explain everything. It's a foundation, and foundations need to be developed and elaborated. But I try and show in these thousands of pages, you can explain many, many things that other schools of economics explain. For instance, growth and effective demand and exchange rates and international trade, macroeconomics, economic development. I try and show that the same basic principles in a concrete form apply to that, to those phenomena. And I try to illustrate it in many ways. And the key point here is that it is not a question of the power of labor versus capital, though that's a real question, nor the question of the advanced countries versus developing countries, that's a real question, but ultimately the power of the market, power of profit over workers and over capitalists. So I oppose the idea that you want to endow capitalists with some superpower which they control the world. They don't. Their own actions produce results that control them. And so crises are not plots. They are devastating outcomes of the power of the market. So that's the first point. If you want to have some questions there.
Oh yeah, I mean that's interesting because in a way I came from history, as you know, and especially now in history there is like this kind of turn back to agency, right? Like historians are writing a lot of histories about agency, and that's also intellectual agency, but also political agency, right? And I think your approach is particularly interesting because it suggests that we need to go back to the structural, to the powers of structure as such.
Yes, and so the point there is that there is agency, but the agency is structurally bounded. And acts of agency have consequences, which are given by the circumstances. And this is, again, a famous phrase from Marx.
Yes.
And make their own history, but not under conditions of their own making. And that's a very important point. And so you don't want to deny agency. You want to situate agency. And obviously the agency of a peasant in a feudal society, or even of a lord in a feudal society, is different from the agency of a worker and of a capitalist in a capitalist society. We all recognize this. But then you have to situate agencies, and you have to know, you have to speak of the structure. And that's my first concern. I do talk about agency, but that's my first concern.
That's good. And I mean, in that sense, there is an underlying assumption about institutions, and especially now the institutional approach, especially in economics, but also in political science and different disciplines, has become mainstream. So I would like to know what do you have to say about those kind of approaches? I'm thinking about Acemoglu and that kind of literature.
Remind me of that, because I want to build up this issue of the structure a bit.
Okay.
Because the state also is an agent that lives within that structure. And that relates to one of the questions you asked about the turn towards neoliberalism.
Yes.
How the state before is a welfare state, and after it's an anti-welfare state, but it's still the capitalist state. And so we have to understand it in that sense. So first, the key point is that the market is a system that creates some kind of order out of disorder.
Yes.
This is again a point in Marx. Capitalists, individual people, workers and capitalists, make decisions on the basis of their expectations of the outcomes. So we earn an income and we expect that we can buy things we want from it and we can do things with it. At the same time, capitalists are busy producing goods individually on the expectation they can sell those goods. And for them to sell those goods, they're making an expectation they can buy the raw materials and hire the labor. So when you look at it from this point of view, the whole system seems like a chaotic set of inconsistent expectations. There's no reason my assumptions about the world of the capitalist market will be true. And we find in the COVID crisis, they're not true. Things happen that change them for both sides, even for the state. So the key first conception, which is really in Adam Smith, is the idea of the invisible hand. But not the invisible hand as it's been vulgarized by bourgeois economics, but the invisible hand as it appears in Smith and even more clearly in Marx as a means of reconciling these discrepancies. And Marx puts it a different way. He says, look, everybody is doing something that is part of the social reproduction process. But how does it fit in the social reproduction process? It fits through errors. I'm wrong about everything I can get. You remember the great run for toilet paper?
Yes.
When we realized that, we were wrong about our expectations. And it's not true that capitalism was farsighted and produced toilet paper. In fact, we had shortages because they didn't see it coming either. So in that context, the difficult question is, how does this crazy system balance? It's not a hard question to say that they are imbalanced. The hard question is, how does the balance come? And here the classical economists, especially Smith and Ricardo, and Smith and Marx, talk about how balance comes about through imbalance. So if there's too much supply in one market, then the price falls. This is a signal to the producers. The price rises, signal to producer to produce more, and vice versa if supply is below demand. But every action you take affects the demand also. So it's not that you can sort of, smoothly go towards a balance. There is no equilibrium. There is turbulent regulation, but there's no such thing as so it's not turbulent equilibrium. It's turbulent regulation. The center of gravity of balance is itself constantly moving because everything you do changes the balance point also. So if you look at it that way, then many empirical phenomena fall directly in place. Because if you look at them, you don't see balance. You see some movement and you see fluctuations. But if you think about looking for the underlying process of regulation, then lo and behold, you see very strong patterns that emerge from that.
Yeah,
Much is about that.
That's why I was interested in bringing Albert Hirschman into this conversation, because he was an economist who I think kind of, even if not coming from a Marxist background, he did understood like equilibrium, but mostly like the economy as a whole as something always precarious and always like leaning towards disappointment and crisis and fluctuations. So that's what I brought Albert Hirschman into the conversation. And I wonder, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that's a very important point. Schumpeter also says something like this, which is the point that, and Hirschman is also reacting to the whole economics tradition of seeing the capitalism system as a self-balancing, smoothly system. And study of history makes it clear that that's not possible. Any elementary study of capitalist dynamics at the macro or micro level will see cycles, turbulence, and you can picture these. My book, in the beginning, I show these cycles, and these are not regular cycles. These are erratic cycles, like a heart that's having a heart attack, or at least a bad phase, right? But they are the regulating mechanism. They go up and then fluctuate, they come down, they go too low, and it's not a question of their achieving equilibrium. It's the question of balance achieved through errors. Errors too high, errors too low, and it's not because the center of gravity is itself moving under the actions we take.
And do you think there are ways in which societies can buffer that fluctuations?
Yes.
And that's where the state comes in, I guess.
Right. And so the state comes in order to react to these, but I need to tell one more part of the story to explain why the state can't do this in a simple way. You asked a question about productivity and wages.
Yep.
Now, it's not true that these are questions of just the power of the two, balance of capital and labor, though there is that's important historical balance. But at the first basic level, it's interesting that Marx tells a story, which we call the story of the reserve army of labor, in which at some moment he says, let's imagine a pool of unemployed labor. And for some reason, capital is growing faster than the supply of labor is growing. So that pool shrinks because they take from the pool their needs for additional labor. So that's good because workers' wages rise, the conditions of labor are better. Now, here's a man who spent his whole life fighting for better conditions of labor. So he should say, well, that's good. It doesn't say that. He says, well, when that happens, profitability begins to fall. As profitability falls, two things happen. First of all, growth slows down. So then the demand for labor slows down. That means to fill the reserve army again. But also, the higher wages for labor gives an incentive for more rapid mechanization. Not mechanization, that's part of capitalism, but more rapid mechanization, the displacement of labor. And that refills the reserve army. And then he says, where's the balance? The balance is when the reserve army does not interfere with the needs of accumulation. Now, this is from a man who spent his whole life trying to change capitalism and change the conditions of labor. And what that tells you is that these conditions are changeable, but there are limits, which is the reaction of the system to those changes. And that relates to two questions you asked. One is the question of the balance of capital and labor, or the productivity and wages. And the other question, which I'm going to bring up, is the question of the role of the state. And they're related to this, because this fundamental regulation mechanism, that's what it is, turbulent regulation of macroeconomic, places a limit on the role of the state. And it helps us understand many phenomena in which the state does intervene and has success in intervening, and then mysteriously finds that that success disappears.
For example, do you want to bring some examples?
Well, related to this, and I want to make one more point, is that it's not true. You asked this question, so I'm now coming to it. It's not true in this process that the reserve army of labor is people who are within the potential labor force. They're people who are kicked out of the labor force or excluded from the labor force. So there's a whole mass of people who will never be included. You asked the question about informal labor and all that. That informal labor is also in the advanced countries. It's just much bigger in developing countries because, in a sense, the capital part of it is much weaker. The growth process is weaker, unless you're talking about China and Korea. And I'm going to come to that, unless the state intervenes to strengthen the ability of local capital to compete in the world market.
Yeah, I was mostly thinking not just about informal labor. I mean, the informal kind of jobs these people get, it's usually the ones they find, but it's mostly marginality. I mean, and I do think, and I'm curious about your thoughts on this, that nowadays, especially after the 70s and 80s, there is an increasing number of people that capital is not interested in explode. I mean, to include into the capitalist accumulation. They are just outside. I mean, they are not even the reserve army. They are just even like below the reserve army.
They are within. The reserve army is not potentially employable labor. It's labor which has been expelled from the capitalist process or never brought into it. I have always argued that if you want to know where the reserve army is, don't look in the United States or Germany and the UK. There's some small, it's in the global. It's in the huge pool of global labor that will never be picked up by capitalism because capitalism doesn't need them. It needs labor, and this is the whole point. The reserve army can't interfere with the global process, but it doesn't follow that the reserve army is potentially employable. It's expelled. I think the idea that there is this huge sector that will never be picked up by capital is exactly the reserve army.
Okay, even if they don't play a role in lowering salaries.
Well, you don't know that they don't play a role in lowering salaries because they are potentially incorporable into the labor process. I mean, look in China, for instance. The people who moved from the agricultural villages who are not really part of the capitalist labor process crowded in. And that's happened historically in capitalism.
Yeah, that's true.
But on a world scale, what capital does is it destroys the foundation of weaker capitalist countries to employ labor because it replaces their capital and their production processes with something else. It destroys, let's say, production on the farms and the villages because these are replaced by capitalist products. And that those coming in from the outside also destroy the labor there without necessarily providing. It's a mythology of capitalism that it needs so much labor that it can employ everything, or that if it lowers the wage sufficiently, everybody would be employed. There's no reason for that. That's a part of the ideas of perfect competition. But even Keynes never believed that. Even Keynes said capitalism has a tendency to have unemployment, persistent unemployment.
I'm thinking more about not economists that were not completely included into the global, let's call it global change of value, like China, but economists that were part of the capitalist world, let's say, like Latin American economists, and that had developed a huge, especially after the 80s, huge sectors of the population that just don't get involved in like having a job or for generations. I mean, they are like absolutely marginalized from almost any kind of welfare provision and from any kind of productive jobs. And what they do is they invent jobs actually that don't have really high profitability rates. So that's what I was asking.
But why is that a puzzle? It's only a puzzle if you think that capital actually has any tendency to employ all the labor.
That's fair enough, yeah. From that point of view.
Or even convert all potential non-labor into labor. I mean, people forget that in advanced countries, women were generally not in the labor force. Yeah. And a place was created for them where they did work as anyone who studied the household. They even worked very hard.
Yeah.
So they were informal labor in that sense, but they were not allowed in the workforce. So a huge army of people, and of course Black people and Native Americans, also frequently excluded from the labor force. So this is not new. It's just that it takes on a larger scale in a country whose capital is not able to expand as rapidly in the world market, and its local expansion is dependent on local factors in the world market. Now, in order to overcome that, you have to do what the advanced countries did, which is protect your local market. And this is Ha-Joon Chang's wonderful little book, which I recommend everyone to read, called Kicking Away the Ladder. He makes the point that all advanced countries got advanced by restricting the market. And if you cannot do that, then you don't have the means to develop. It doesn't follow if you do it, you will. Many governments are just corrupt and restricting the markets to protect local capitalists and themselves. So we know that in itself, restrictions are not good. But it doesn't follow that opening up countries to the world market is good either. It can be devastating. So
would you say...
the analogy I use, and this is Ha-Joon Chang's story, basically, the world market is like a boxing ring. You don't want to step into the boxing ring without training, and training good enough to fight real boxers, and you don't want to step into the boxing ring with Muhammad Ali because you're going to get killed anyway. So with this in mind, you prepare for the areas in which you can succeed. And that was South Korea, and Germany before that, and China, and now India beginning. And they all recognize that you need the state, a developmental state, but that means a state that protects local capital at the same time that it punishes them if they fail. And that's what the South Korea example and China example is very clear.
Well, but one could say that those cases, maybe not South Korea, but certainly China and India, were in a way exceptions in terms of the scale of the internal market and the scale of the labor force and the scale of, I mean, what we know about the huge populations. And that may not be the case in some, for instance, I'm sorry that I keep bringing up Latin America, but it's just because of the audience. That might not be the case. It might have been in Brazil during the 60s, and Brazil was kind of the miracle of the time, according to the World Bank and the IMF and stuff. But that's not exactly the same. Or rather, that, I mean, what happens when you have salaries high enough, to avoid the attraction of, for instance, of foreign investment that you may need to develop. I mean, are there limits to those strategies? I mean, because South Korea, it's a case that many economists used to or cite here in South America or in Latin America as a whole as what governments should do, but it's not always easy when you have like a labor force that has already certain social rights or certain standard of living.
Yes, I mean, that's clearly, those are important factors, but if they were the only factor or the dominant factor, China would not have developed. China has a huge market, but the internal market wasn't what causes development, because it always had that internal market. I mean, for let's say 3,000 years, but at least in the post-war period, it was a transformation of its conditions of production. And that transformation doesn't necessarily lead to the development of China without it's able to externalize that into the world market. That's very important. Now, China could have done it. I mean, the whole point of the Chinese Revolution was to do it internally. The whole point of the Soviet Revolution was to do it internally. But confronting the world market means that you have to have a different type of enterprise and a different type of rules. And that's not all. I mean, it requires a state which is different from the traditional state in most countries, actually. You know, India too. I don't know if you know the sociologist called Vivek Chibber.
Yeah.
Okay. So you must, of course.
I took a class with Professor Jan Prakash at Princeton.
Yeah. So his book about India and South Korea is very much an examination of why India didn't succeed despite its huge internal market, and South Korea did succeed despite its small internal market. So we shouldn't attribute the internal market to being the source of success. I mean, of course, you have to be more concrete, but.
Yeah, I see your point. I'm thinking here about Atul Kohli and his book, but yeah, I see your point here.
Yeah, let me move on to one important point here, following from this. It's possible to have very rapid development in some situations without having the apparent consequences of rising, falling profitability, as the Reserve Army labor example, or inflation, or rising interest rates. And the two very striking examples of this, one is Nazi Germany. When Hitler comes in, he not only terrorizes the population and murders many parts of the population, even before that, he has taken control of the economy in the sense that he's got this huge war effort, mobilized economy, and he removes unemployment within a very short period of time, massive unemployment.
And the wages of destruction.
Yeah, and this removal of the unemployment is one thing that gave him tremendous support. But you notice that he didn't have inflation. He didn't have a slowdown in growth. He didn't have higher interest rates. And you say that, well, how come? The answer is because he froze wages. He told capitalists, if you have a rise in prices, you will be in deep trouble. And he told the central bank, you must keep interest rates low. So wages were frozen, prices were frozen, interest rates were frozen. In this period, you got the huge effects of deficit spending without any of the negative consequences. And the US did exactly the same in World War II. Froze prices, that was called war profiteering if you raise prices. And it was a serious and potentially criminal offense. Labor was told for the war effort, you can't raise your wages, you can't fight for higher wages. And the central bank was told to freeze the interest rate. Now, both of those are parallel movements that, in effect, free the capitalist system from its own feedback. There's an important point here. So then, in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, Keynesians looking at this, Kalecki calls the Nazi development of the economy, the first application of Keynesian economics. And World War II is another application of Keynesian economics. But so they thought, okay, now we know how to control a capitalist economy. We run deficits if we have unemployment until we get to full employment. We saw this already working in front of our eyes, and it didn't work. They pumped up the economy, and you got a growth in your reduction in unemployment, and then you got inflation.
Yeah, the Phillips curve.
And they were in a problem because if they pumped up the economy more, they'd get more inflation. But if they lowered it, they'd get more unemployment. And this was a big Phillips curve and all the means of adjusting that. But notice the difference here. In the post-war period, the market was not put to sleep. Prices could rise, wages could rise, interest rates rose tremendously. And here, the feedback mechanism of the market showed the limits of the state. It could not go beyond those because in order to do that, it had to interfere in the three key arenas of the market: labor, capital, and finance.
So my next question would be, because you mentioned in your book, in your last book, you mentioned as one of the successful cases, the Swedish case, right?
Yes. Yes.
But however, I mean, the cases you were referring so far, the Nazi Germany, China nowadays, the Soviet Union, are cases in which there are limits to, let's say, the expression of popular discontent or some sort of dissent. So there is a way to do this, to accomplish this kind of development project without the turbulence that you associate to the West in the 60s and 70s with, let's say, a democracy. I mean, it's a really bold word, but you know what I mean.
It depends on the outcomes, and those outcomes are not something you can just move two variables in a textbook to get. You know, it's historical outcomes.
Yeah.
South Korea suppressed dissent. There's no question about that. China also. On the other hand, it delivered huge gains because it was able to keep labor down. Now, that's something we don't like to hear, because other countries keep labor down and they give all the gains to the rich and fat capitalist class who doesn't do anything. But in South Korea, there's the other side of it, which is the discipline of capital. Not just the suppression of labor, but also the discipline in the sense that capitalists were directed towards improving in the world market. And if they didn't, they were shut down. And that, in some sense, is China before it got too marketized. Now there's much more chaos in China. But the tremendous emphasis on increasing productivity. Why should China increase productivity? After all, increased productivity means a less of a demand for labor for the same amount of output, right? So why you should do that? Perhaps you should do what Mao wanted to do and do, local development everywhere and a furnace in every village. But that didn't work. Among other reasons, it doesn't give much scope for growth, but the main factor is that you cannot survive in the world market that way.
How did Sweden? Yeah.
Sweden developed its internal capital, and it also kept labor and capital in some kind of balance. There was explicit agreement between labor and capital, enforced perhaps, but not enforced through dictatorship, so that wages didn't rise faster than productivity in most periods. And that meant that profitability wasn't falling, because if wages rise faster than productivity, that's a rising rate of surplus value. Falling rate of surplus value. And that's bad for capital. So that balance didn't last forever, but it lasted a pretty long time. And in that process, the Swedish welfare state also redistributed the benefits of that development, so that it wasn't just a massive inequality at the bottom. There was a lot, Sweden is not a paradise, but there was a lot of redistribution so that it became a rich country in a double sense. It was not only rich on average, but it was rich in the sense of the distribution of the wealth that was created. Now, that is a difficult formula to attain.
And I want to push a bit like further and ask you like why Sweden could do this. I mean, what was different? It was going back to the institutional problem, or it was the kind of incentives that the institution created. It was the ability of the political class. It was
all of those. With Sweden also had a very powerful labor movement.
Yeah.
A labor movement actually was in government at various times and understood both sides of that story and chose to make it a successful capitalist country rather than go something beyond that. And they were pretty successful for a time. Then the ability to Sweden to compete in the world market was definitely more difficult, but by now it's a very rich country. And it did so without, let's say, the South Korean path, which is another path to it. But the key element of that path is that if you develop the productivity of labor, you have to some use for that that will come back to the system, and the world market is a very big market compared to small Sweden.
Yeah, definitely. And do you think that the global conditions nowadays allow those kind of strategies, or the financial deregulation and certain new features of the global economy are not the, let's say,
I think
a great environment?
It's much harder because the world capitalist system is much stronger and much more developed. And also the advanced countries suppress these things. The WTO is not there to benefit development, it's there to protect capital. And given all the patent restrictions and the rules and the punishments that can come from these global organizations, it's much harder to have a local path unless you are very big and can resist that, like China and perhaps like India. So it's not the same conditions.
So maybe it's a good opportunity to bring the neoliberalism issue to this conversation. What do you think about the term? What do you think has changed in the late 70s, beginning of the 80s in the global economy?
Several things I wanted to talk about here. The key point I've been making is that the balance between capital and labor has two effects. If it's good for labor, it improves the standard of living of labor and improves the conditions of labor. And that was what we call in the West, the golden age of labor. 1947 to 1967, roughly, 68. And in that period, the standard of living of workers rose continually for a couple of generations. Unions were strong. The state was strong as a welfare state. In other words, in making sure that the conditions of many people were addressed. So in those conditions, it seemed like capitalism had found the sweet spot. It had found the Swedish path, so to speak, right? And everybody said that. Everybody believed it. But in fact, if you look in that period, and I show the data in my book, in the chapter on crisis, you see what's happening is that the wage share is rising. In the sense of Marx, the rate of exploitation is falling. As that's falling, which is great for labor, it was not so good for capital because the profit share is the other half of the wage share. So the profit share is falling. As the profit share is falling, growth is falling, profitability is falling. You can track all of that. And in that process, you get you get slower growth, which is a source of the contradiction of Keynesian policies, why they got stuck in stagnation and inflation. That's why that period is called period of stagflation. So in that period comes the reaction of the capitalist class, who are in fact restricted and reduced in their profitability by this successful growth of labor strength. And they counterattack. I mean, explicitly counterattack. They attack the unions, they attack the welfare state, and they change the welfare state from a welfare state to a neoliberal state. Even, it doesn't matter, Democrats or Republicans, in Labour or Tories in England, they all shift in this direction.
Yes.
And that brings about the second stage. You asked whether neoliberal is a good idea, a good phrase. I don't like it. It suggests there's something. It's the old notion of liberal, which is, after all, pro-market and all of that. But it's really market worship, as George Soros calls it. It's a period where you're told that if you have more and more markets, everything will be fine. So the ideology of perfect markets come back in the form of operational push towards more markets. Also, globalization now gets supported by the state in a different way. So globalized finance, globalized industry. And the story all the time is the problem with developing countries is that they don't have enough markets. The problem with the developed countries, they don't have enough markets. And for a period of time, that gives a burst. And then its effects begin to appear. And those effects are frequently devastating, especially for the developing world, frequently devastating.
So what do you think? I mean, in a way, there is this idea that neoliberalism is something that these evil people like Milton Friedman and Hayek and the Montpellerian Society created in the background, and they kind of apply these neoliberal ideas to the world. And in your story, it seems somehow different. It's more like a structural phenomenon, and it has to do not with the greedy bourgeoisie, but with the let's say, the worship of profit as such. So what are your thoughts on the influence of these neoliberal champions, let's say?
Okay, Friedman and Hayek are very different. Hayek is far superior thinker. Friedman is the pusher of free markets. Everything will be fine, but Hayek doesn't actually say that. Hayek says that, in fact, the market does not reward people necessarily on the basis of their skill or ability, but rather in the basis of their success, which could be accidental, as he says, in the market. So it doesn't pick up the best people. And he says one of the difficulties of explaining this point of view is that you have to explain to people who think that by hard work and training and all of that, they'll succeed. And he says the hardest thing is to explain it to people in education and students and all that who make the effort, that only some of them will succeed. And they could be the ones who are not the best. And so he admits that the market does not pick up the best, but perhaps the most fortunate. Now, this is not Friedman. Friedman says, oh, we pick up the best, the market is the best. Hayek doesn't say that. Hayek says, given these conditions, it may be necessary for the state to have a minimal standard living or a minimal support level.
Yeah, universal income, yeah.
Yeah, so Hayek is a superior thinker, much superior. That doesn't mean I necessarily agree with it. I gave a talk on Hayek and Marx, where there are many parallels there, which people don't pay attention to. But there are parallels. The difference is that they come out on different sides in the end about capitalism. But their clear-eyed view of capitalism has overlapping elements.
That's interesting. So before we move to the present, let's say, I was wondering, maybe I know you don't follow the Latin American politics on a daily basis because of obvious reasons, but I was curious about your connections with the dependency theory. Because when you talk about monopolies and criticize the explanation of capitalism based on monopolies, you implicitly are making a reference to some of those dependentistas, as we call them. So I was wondering what kind of influence they have on you. I mean, I know they were kind of influential in South Asia, especially, I mean, maybe not the dependentistas, but yes, Prebisch was kind of influential. So, and under the dependentistas, Celso Furtado and Fernando Ricardos as well. So I was curious about that, and I'm sure our audience will be interested.
Well, so it seems like an odd way to start, but let me start with David Ricardo.
Okay.
Ricardo's argument says that as capitalism develops, the need for agricultural goods, food and mining and all that develops. But these goods have two operative mechanisms. One is technical change, which is the same thing as industrial goods. And the other is the declining fertility as you move from the better lands and better mines to the worse lands and worse mines. As you expand, the good ones are used up first and the rest come later. And unlike capital, they cannot be reproduced in the same way. So according to this, Ricardo concludes that agricultural goods have two components, one which is shared by industry, technical change. So in itself, the price of agriculture versus industry would not have any direction. Sometimes high, sometimes low, but they would move together. But given that agricultural production has a diminishing fertility margin, less and less efficient, that means the price of agricultural goods will rise relative to industrial goods under free competition and normal capitalism. So this is a very famous proposition because it implies that the terms of trade of agricultural producers will improve through capitalism. And the Latin American debate, especially Prebisch and others, picked up on this argument implicitly and said, well, that's not what's happening. What's happening instead is the price of agricultural goods is falling relative to industrial goods. And this must be because the center countries are manipulating competition. Now, it's interesting to let me digress back for a moment. Marx is studying Ricardo. And Marx sees something in the empirical evidence. He writes to his friend, Friedrich Engels, and he says, "Dear Fred," this is a letter from Marx to Engels. It's available in the Marx-Engels correspondence. He says, "Dear Fred, you know that Ricardo says that the price of agricultural goods must rise relative to industrial goods. But you know that if you look at the empirical evidence, the price of agricultural goods frequently falls relative to industrial goods." And then Marx pauses and says, "Whenever I see a contradiction between the theory and the facts, I always go with the facts." Because the object of theory is not to deny the facts, but to understand them. So then Marx offers an explanation. The explanation, he says, is that agriculture and the industrial and capitalist development also found many new ways to make agriculture more productive, to find new sources of agriculture. For instance, to develop transportation. Well, transportation means that a good land was too far away to use and therefore too expensive, now becomes a land that's available. And that means that there is no particular direction in the Marxist version of Ricardo's argument to the terms of trade. Now, come back to Latin America. They are picking implicitly up the standard theory, the Ricardian theory, really, and they're finding it's not true. So then where do you answer that? Instead of going back to Marx, by the way, Marx's arguments are scattered in all different places like seashells on a shore. You know, they're not in one place, and the books, volume 2 and 3, were never finished. So you have to look hard to find these kinds of elements. But they then say, well, look at the center. And here they rely on another argument, very important in the Marxist tradition, which is from Hilferding, which is the idea that capitalism is developed to the stage of monopoly capital and finance is the highest form of monopoly capital, an argument which even Lenin picks up. Yeah. Once that's picked up, it's the absolute bedrock of the Marxist tradition. Every political party, every school of thought, left in Latin America, in the US, in the developed capitalist world, says that capitalism is now monopolistic. Well, okay, so what is a monopoly? Monopoly is a power of individual capitals over the market, the power to get better than what competition would give them. Well, then it's natural to say that these outcomes come from monopoly. In the book, I try to show that there's no evidence for monopoly power in terms of profitability. What people are confusing is the scale with monopoly power. And why is that? Because in neoclassical economics, all firms have to be small to be competitive. Because competition, by definition, perfect competition is firms too small to influence the outcome. In that sense, monopoly appears as a means of escaping the limits of the market, the pressure of the market, by insulating yourself and all of that. There's no evidence of it. If you look at the empirical evidence, big capitals don't have higher profit rates, they actually have lower profit rates. But their profit rates are more stable. So when you adjust for risk, and this is the business literature does a lot of this, by the way, you see that their profit rates are roughly equal. That is, big scale means that you fight in a market with other big players. And it's true that you may damage small players, but you have other big players who are competitive. Competition takes the form of big capitals or bigger capitals, and newer ones that come up from nowhere, like computers and software, and now Tesla and all of that. Really, they come out, and they can become huge, but others will come. So, and they don't say, by the way, that there's no competition. They say that they're subject to intense competition from other big players. So that means that the idea of monopoly capital, as it's in the Marxist literature, is a false idea, the stage of monopoly capital. Now, what's the purpose of this idea? If you believe this idea, then you don't have to take the classical tradition seriously, because Marxists say, well, you know, Marx was talking about in his day, he was brilliant in his day, but is no longer relevant for that because now we have monopoly. And monopoly is the power of big scale over the market. And I've always argued it's the opposite. The market dominates, and we can show it empirically and theoretically, and that therefore big scale is a certain degree of insulation, but it's not big enough to, in fact, give you higher profitability. And one more point along that. It's been noted that when you study big capitals, they are not just concentrated, but they're centralized. And what that means is that they are engaged in many different activities. Any one big capital produces thousands, if not tens of thousands of different products. So Walmart is a big retail capital. It's not a producer, some production, but it's a seller. But there are many others. General Motors produces many, many cars. There are others who produce many types of goods. Drug companies produce many goods. Food producers, many goods. Now, the whole point of this is that, and this is an article by a man named Jim Clifton in the first issue of the Cambridge Journal of Economics, and he's working for an American agency whose job is to keep track of big capitals. And he says, look, big capitals are more ruthlessly competitive than small. Why? Because they own all these different portfolios, and their goal is to make profit. But then any portfolio that's not doing well, they get rid of. Why would they keep doing it if they have many different options? Why put their capital in a losing enterprise or a weak enterprise that they own rather than another one that they own? So his argument is the internal dynamics of big capital is ruthless competition. And we forget that, but it's absolutely true if you observe them. Walmart doesn't sell things for which it doesn't make money. It just dumps them. Even if it produces themselves, they put it somewhere else. So I have opposed the idea for both theoretical reasons coming from the theory of real competition, but also for empirical reasons. And we can see again and again. Now, coming back to the Prebisch thing, there is no doubt that the advanced countries have some power to restrict the entry of new countries into the market. But it doesn't follow that they determine the terms of trade that way.
In Prebisch, it also had to do with the power of trade unions in the West and in Europe and in the developed countries, and vis-a-vis the developing countries, and how they couldn't push salaries that to a really low level. But yeah, it's true that the monopoly thing, it's kind of important in the dependency theory. Do you have any contact with any of these guys, like Sergio Furtado?
Yeah, I've talked to them in many different countries, and I've read about them, and I've supervised dissertations on them. So yes, I do know that tradition.
Okay.
And I have to say that I have talked to some of them who were stunned by the fact that competition came back. Because as they themselves said, their whole argument was based on the idea of the growing power of monopoly capital. So how can monopoly capital then suddenly be attacked by other capitals like China, South Korea? Well, this is before China. South Korea and Vietnam and all of those. And there they said, you know, and they were very honest. They said we were taken aback. We were stunned, in fact, because within our theory, this was really not possible.
We can move towards like the last set of questions that has to do with the situation of the global economy nowadays. And I would like to start with the 2008 crisis question, if that's okay with you. What changed then? Are we seeing the end of neoliberalism as we knew it, or at least the shape that capitalism took after the late 70s, let's say, or not? Or this is just business as usual?
I think it undermines some of the premises or some of the claims of neoliberalism that the market is the best way to proceed into the future. There's been a lot of pushback against that, but it has not changed the economic profession. That's very clear. They have retreated to their castles and just continue to produce models of this and that that don't really work. But excuse me one second. These models become more distant, so to speak. On the other hand, orthodox economists are admitting in a kind of sotto voce way that their theory is bad at some fundamental level. In every discipline of orthodox economics, there's a set of issues that are called paradoxes. And what a paradox means to them is something that they can't explain from their theory without abandoning the theory. International trade, the stock market, behavior, and now behavioral economics is a huge discipline, but what most of it is doing within the profession, they take a model and they look at people and go, oh, people don't behave that way. So what? The model is already a very bad model, so why are you interrogating the model? Why shouldn't you build a model from the behavior of actual people? Recently, Paul Krugman has written about this and also gave a lecture in which he says that he disavows his own work because it was based on this foundation, and even disavows, at least in that lecture, the Nobel Prize, the Swedish Central Bank Prize, because it's based on this work. And when asked what should people do, he said, well, study how real people behave and study how real markets behave. Well, that's what I do. I've been doing it for a very long time. He hasn't come to me and said, oh, you're right, but I've been doing this for a long time because I understand that's how the scientific method should proceed. You theorize from the reality that you begin from, you abstract from that, but then you have to go back to it. And if your path is correct, you make more and more concrete factors. These are not imperfections. They're things that you take into detail more. And here's an example I always give, but I really like this. In a Newtonian world, if you drop two objects, a feather and a ball, a steel ball, in a vacuum, they'll fall at the same rate. So this was shown in an experiment on the moon where that's what's actually dropped them, right? You see them fall. But if you introduce air into that, they won't fall together. They will fall, the steel ball is faster. Now, that's not an imperfection of Newtonian's theory, that's its perfection. Because that theory says I can explain why they come when I introduce a fluid, and a fluid is not an imperfection, it's a concretion. And this confusion between imperfection and concretion is very fundamental because it comes from neoclassical theory. All science knows that you have to introduce more concrete factors, and that does not overthrow the theory, but it's a deepening of the theory. But you have to show that these factors are consistent with the initial foundation. Otherwise, it is, in fact, an imperfection in the theory.
It's interesting to see the last releases from the IMF and these kind of new policy advices that they're distributing. That, in a way, tells you something about how the discipline is somehow changing, or at least admitting that some things might have been wrong. But I was wondering, I had one question on the the kind of looming large financial crisis on emerging economies. As you know, Ecuador and Argentina kind of reach agreements with the private bondholders. Now there are other countries that are kind of under a lot of stress, like Zambia or Lebanon or different. And of course, this is aggravated with the COVID crisis. So what are your thoughts on this? Are we facing a debt crisis or a financial crisis coming from the emerging economies? Is that not going to happen? What do you think?
I have studied Brazil and somewhat Argentina. I can't speak to other countries concretely. And I don't believe one should theorize without having looked in considerable detail in the circumstances. But I knew something about the Brazilian case and how under Lula there was growth, there was redistribution of income, substantial, and improvement in the standard of living of the people at the bottom and labor, and that this did not lead to, or rather led to problems in foreign trade, where the cost of Brazilian products was in trouble, but also due to the rise in materials prices, which had a big impact on the condition of Brazil. But I argue that there was another deeper problem, which is the same problem I talked about in the US in the 60s and 70s, which is that if you raise wages and you won't raise productivity fast enough, or you raise wages faster than productivity, then you have falling profitability. And you can track that in Brazil. They did have falling profitability. Falling profitability means that the country slows down in growth. It may be less able to compete on the world market. I wrote a paper about this. It's on my homepage. It was published in FIDE.
Yep.
And the point of the paper is that there are concrete circumstances which are relevant to Brazil only. But as a capitalist country, as a country now committed to capitalism, there are factors which are common to capitalists. This brings me back to the early argument we have. What is the role, what is the power of the state? The power of the state is limited by the power of capital if you're committed to a capitalist economy. And I haven't mentioned in our discussion so far what the laws of international trade are. But that's a fundamental issue, because those laws are what feed back, appear to come from the world market, but they're really intrinsic part of the market itself. And you can track, and I show in the paper how one can do that, the consequences for Brazil of having gone beyond the limits of what capitalism will tolerate under the conditions that it's developed in Brazil. Now, I'm not saying I oppose those things. What I've said all along is if you're going to do those things, you have to know the limits or figure out some way to go beyond those limits by interfering in capitalist feedback mechanisms, as we talked about in World War II and so on. And even in the capitalist countries, when they went beyond those limits, they suffered crises. The 1968-69 was the beginning of a long downturn. I call it the crisis of stagflation. And you can see all the data shows very clearly that they had real problems with growth, unemployment, and those problems led not only to a reaction against the welfare state, they led to a shift of labor itself from unions to the neoliberal state and to capitalists, because they're getting employment. The growth went up, actually. And labor was lower wages, but jobs. And their allegiance shifted.
One further question that you might or might not want to talk about, which is about this kind of new Cold War that people are talking about between China and the United States. And well, you have Branko Milanovic's book behind you, and and he talks about the rising of China, how that reduces inequality, like global inequality, but rise global inequality, internal inequality in many countries, and how that create like certain tensions and mainly political conflict. So do you think there's some sort of a Cold War re-emerging? What's the nature of this competition between China and the United States nowadays?
Joseph Stiglitz says that China has always been the dominant power in the world, except for a mere couple of centuries.
That's kind of true.
So it may be coming back to its historical place in the world. Now, the advanced capitalist world is not just individual countries anymore. It has a whole global power and solidarity. So, but the key thing is that China's tremendous rise in the productivity of labor and its rise in employment and some rise in wages is exactly the case of wages rising much more slowly than the productivity of labor. And that is, unfortunately, one of the ways to successful development. Chinese labor, in many cases, works 50 or 60 hours a week. Labor in Europe is between 35 and 40 hours. In England, in the US, it's about 40 hours. Chinese manufacturing wages are $2.35 in about 5 years ago. In the US, they were $23 or $24 per hour. Now, those mean that the US, with its big market and its power and all that, is fundamentally at a disadvantage in international trade. And China, a big country being it is, it can soak up a lot of the world market. That wasn't true in Korea. Korea was pretty small relative to the world market. Vietnam is small. Bangladesh is small. So there's plenty of room for them to occupy niches. But China is very big, and it's rapidly taking on. It's very committed in the same South Korea sense. It recognizes what one must do. And I don't know what the limits of that are. I mean, I don't know. China is also a military power. It's also a nuclear power. So a Cold War, everybody hopes that there's not going to be a hot war, but a Cold War has limits. I mean, the Cold War can be a balance between two equals, or it can be a balance between unequals. The Soviet Union was a potential equal, but became rapidly an unequal. So the Cold War balance shifted. I mean, they had weaponry and all that, but their growth prospects essentially died. And in the internal structure also died. I don't see that in China yet, but it doesn't mean it won't happen. And the reason is the following. As China moves to a capitalist economy, the ruling circles become more tied to capitalism. That's kind of obvious. And that means that the power to regulate the system gets weaker, because now you have a conflict between the supposed power of the state to help all people and the needs of a very powerful class which has emerged that needs to keep labor in place and keep wages low and keep people working really hard. And so you get this contradiction. And yes, China's inequality has reduced tremendously, but poverty is still widely available and widely present in China. And political suppression is also very widespread. I've heard labor leaders in the US say that they favor democracy in China and favor better conditions in China because it'll make the wages in China go up, and then the US will have a better advantage, competitive advantage against China. So it's not because I'm not saying all people, but I've heard this explicit argument that we're in favor of labor unions in China and all that, because then our side will have more of a competitive advantage. That's very perceptive of them.
Which is true.
It's true. I think it's absolutely true. So, but I saw, and I mentioned this in a recent paper, which has just been accepted, so it's not yet on my homepage, but if you go to working papers at the New School,
yep.
It's RepEc, you'll see a paper by Isabella Weber and myself, which is about China, which is about the rise of China and its, the theory behind that and our application of the arguments I'm making to China very concretely. And we make the point that China is still subject to the laws of the world market. But those laws, the effect of those laws depend on how you develop internally. Very important point, how you develop internally. Where China is going to go, it's not something you can unroll from a crystal ball. It depends on the political balances.
Yeah, of course. But now I'm thinking about this point you have made about this labor or this trade union in the United States, or these labor leaders thinking about what would they like for China. And of course, you're not. I mean, I don't want to put you in the position of having to give like a political program or a political orientation to the left in the world, but I'm interested about how a progressive politics should look like nowadays. I mean, because in a way, part of, as we were talking about, like part of the inequalities that rise in the West, let's say, after the 80s, had as a counterbalance the reduce of global inequalities. So I was wondering, what should be, if there is an internationalism of sorts that needs to be readdressed by progressive movements, or how labor should think about their place or its place in both at national and international levels. I know it's a complicated question, but
complicated question, and I can't sort of unroll a simple answer. But when I think about such things, I try to think about what are the consequences in a capitalist world. It's a different story if you imagine that you're leaving capitalism behind, but I don't think many people on the left are speaking about that nowadays. So the question is, what are the limits of development in a capitalist world? And the limits depend on, so to speak, how narrow the channel is. In some periods of time, it's fairly wide. And so you have room for development without threatening the growth of capital and all that. Other times it's pretty narrow. Right now, it's pretty narrow in the US, but it's fairly wide in China. That's may seem paradoxical, but there's a big gap between wages and productivity in China. And though the low cost of Chinese goods is a very important factor, in there is room. But let me qualify that. There's room now. McKinsey and Company, which is one of the biggest sort of consulting and evaluation firm in the world, and certainly I saw a study there where they had a list of different products across the US and China. And their prediction was that China was losing its competitive advantage, and that at some point this would shift to the US for certain products, only certain products, because the Chinese wages and then unit labor costs were rising, and their advantage in particular products was beginning to be eroded. Now that's very interesting because they're looking at it from a business point of view. And the cost structure determines the ability to compete on the world market. And the growth of Chinese wages, which often people say, you know, inequality is reduced, the wages are great. Or the trouble is that the other side of that is the limits to that. And I don't think, I'm not able myself to talk about that concretely because you really have to go industry by industry with McKinsey. But they are pretty hard, clear-eyed about the fact that China's development has certain consequences for the internal market, for the external market. Now, there are people who believe, well, then you can switch to the internal market, perhaps. That's not clear to me at all. But perhaps China could give up some of its place in the world market and shift that to the internal market.
This is the last question. I don't want to take more of your time, but you just said that you don't see many people on the left thinking about a different kind of horizon, a different kind of political horizon, not just thinking about how to improve capitalism, but how to think about the different political system. And it's interesting because, especially in the West or Europe, Latin America, and the States, we are seeing a rising of inequality and a rising of social crisis. But the outcome of that is not particularly, let's say, shiny. What we are seeing is the emergence of the Bolsonaros or of the Donald Trumps and those kind of really right-wing political governments, and not the emergence of or the consolidation of political, let's say, political orientation on the left. Why?
Well, I think one of the lessons that the left has a lot of trouble getting is that when people are left behind, they don't necessarily turn to the left. They can
No, yeah.
to the right. And they frequently turn to the right because the right has this big advantage. The resentment can be channeled very easily into already existing channels. Racism and xenophobia, they're always there. You don't have to develop, as on the left, this idea of a future society and all. You just say, look, the past was better for you, and the past is therefore where we want to go. And that's an argument that works. We've seen it everywhere. And the answer to that argument has to be some way to improve the conditions of these labor, of these workers, of these people. I know people who are absolutely wonderful people, who are strong Trump supporters. And that comes about from their experience. That comes about the experience as workers or small businesses. They say, we've been cast aside. If we were white, we were pushed aside by white males, we were pushed aside by women and by blacks, and we've lost our place in society. Well, that's true to some extent, and that feeds this whole idea. The solution to that is not to have one group displace another. But that's a very hard thing to do in a capitalist economy, because you don't decide that. The market has a big say in that. If some people get jobs, it doesn't follow that the others will also have jobs. It's what I call the caravan problem. Donald Trump says there's a caravan of people coming from Latin America and Mexico, and they're going to come and they invade us, so we'll build a wall to stop it. But the thing is that most workers, they also feel that way. They don't want the immigrants, unless the immigrants are doing jobs that they don't want to do. So it's quite natural. And you see this in Europe now. Yep. As a non-white person and a Muslim-born person, I can tell you in the US, I've experienced that a lot. But now when I go to Europe, I see the same thing. I always saw the same thing. It's just that it gotten much stronger. And in some sense, that's understandable. It doesn't mean you have to sympathize with it. For the left to offer an alternative, it has to do more than say that we want to respect other people and equality. It doesn't address the issue of job loss, of the loss of place, which is very, very important in social life. And unless we can offer something, and it's not clear to me what we can offer, by the way, unless we can offer something that says you don't have to give up what you had or what you want in order to allow other people to come in, you're going to get this. I see this everywhere. I mean, and it's understandable.
Okay, yeah, I guess I agree with you. Sadly, I agree with you. It's kind of pessimistic, but yeah.
Well, I want to make one more point before we go off, which is okay. The point I didn't get to. Capitalism is very efficient. People always talk about the inefficiency of that, but it's extremely efficient in the one thing that it should be efficient in, which is getting profit. It extracts profit from everything, from disasters and from discoveries, from pollution. It can extract profit. And that's because capital and profit making doesn't care about the consequences unless there are consequences for it. It's not wrong for capitalists to say we'll pollute the environment. It's right, because from their point of view, it's profitable. It's not wrong for them to have a large mass of unemployed people who will never get into capital. That's not their problem. You say they don't care about it, but they care about them insofar it affects their profits. It's not their job to care about the environment, not their job to care about employment, not their job to care about democracy either. It depends on the benefits it offers them. So if you think of it that way, capitalism doesn't care about people. People are instruments into the system unless they threaten capital, unless they have a counter offensive. And we see this developing now in inequality, on unemployment, on poverty and the environment. But if these are individual things, which each group talking about its own focus, so to speak, I don't think that'll be sufficient. Maybe we can bring back a period where the welfare state is back. It wasn't a bad period, but wasn't not a good people for black people, not a good state for many other people, but it was good for white workers. I'm just not optimistic, and I would like to be optimistic, but I don't see the force, at least in the West. If anything, the rising force is the right. Now, Brazil, Argentina, that's a different possible story. I mean, if Lula comes back, who knows? But Lula has to then also pay attention to the world market in a different way. I don't mean to, I'm not talking down to Lula. He's brilliant and was very effective. But Lula's economists had to pay attention to the world market. And it brings me back to my starting point. In the developing world, the economic theory that is dominant almost everywhere is neoclassical theory. So progressive people have to take this bizarre framework and bend it and twist it to explain circumstances and draw consequences from that. But the framework being what it is, your consequences and your prescriptions don't work because you're starting from a... And the most sensible and apparently logical alternative is to take that framework and introduce imperfections into it. So then you can talk about imperfect markets, you can talk about monopoly power, you can talk about wage rigidity, and this is the dominant school in the West, post-Keynesian economics, but it's also now spreading in the developing world. My difficulty is that I believe that these are both fundamentally flawed in the sense that their conclusions and their prescriptions don't work. And so now we have a problem. Here we have progressives. Stiglitz is a very progressive person, and Krugman in his own way also, but there are many progressives, the Lavoie and people in Europe who are wonderful progressive people. But if this concept, if this theory is not able to grasp the reality, then the consequences of being wrong are on the people who they experiment on, not on the professors. And so the difficulty is that we really have to take the theory very, very seriously. You should take it with great fear about being wrong. And I think much of the left doesn't do that. I've seen again and again at conferences and at rallies and all that, people are absolutely convinced that if you have the right power and the right strength and the right commitment, you can change the world. Well, that's certainly true, but if you don't understand the world, the consequences of that will not be what you think. So I think it's a little bit dangerous to simply jump into the idea that it's the strength of your conviction that'll produce the result that you like. And that brings me back to where I started. Marx spent almost all of his life studying capitalism and trying to write about it. Now, he didn't finish. He failed in some very fundamental sense of finishing. But if you study what he did, if you look at what he did, he spent an enormous time of his life understanding in order to pull the theory together. And the elements of those theories, Smith, Ricardo, Marx, and Keynes, which can be founded in this framework, are there. And we shouldn't treat them as separate. We should treat them as an organic whole. They're like a civilization. We come down, we see these great buildings which have collapsed. And we think, well, okay, that's in the past. But in fact, these buildings are theoretical edifices, and we need to understand they're very powerful if they are allowed to be put back together, pieced back together. And that has been my motivation pretty much my whole life. This book took me 16 years to write, and it took me probably 20 or 30 years to provide the foundation. Along many ways, I didn't have the answer. So what did I do? First, I read the empirical evidence. Then I went also simultaneous to other theories, but I always comparing the theories to the empirical evidence. And from this, sometimes ideas come, and you put those ideas together, and you see that they fit. It's a jigsaw puzzle, but it's a fluid puzzle.
It's a very impressive book, I have to say, and it's a very impressive intellectual effort. And I do agree that we need to care about theory and about the study of reality more coming from the left. We are somehow too prone to just believe in our strength just because of a conviction or something. But there are also like limits coming from the global economy that we need to understand.
That's right. We have to come together to develop an understanding. It doesn't come from the air. It comes from practice and work to develop an understanding not only of the concrete political goals and needs, which many brave and wonderful people have been engaged in, but also to develop the theory. You know who does this is the right. The right funds huge amount of activities about the basic theory. The left doesn't fund anything, usually doesn't have any money, but if it does, it funds the latest item. Inequality, racism, this and that, poverty. But when you ask how do you identify it, it's still back in the standard framework with a progressive cast. And I just think we can show again and again it doesn't work because it runs into limits that they don't expect. Trade theory and all of that, you know.
Yeah,
and that's what happened to Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods is an example of a theoretical understanding applied to the actual world. And it failed because the consequences of that application were completely unexpected from the point of view of the theorists.
Could have been different if Keynes had won that Bretton Woods battle?
No, I don't think so. And the reason is that Keynes had a great sense of capitalism, but his theory, a practical sense, and he was a great theoretician, but he didn't spend much time on underlying theory. He took neoclassical theory, and he said he abandoned it. But many parts that he left open, well, what is the theory of profitability in the theory of effective demand? A very fundamental question in classical economics. What is the theory of exchange rates? What is the theory of interest rates? Keynes has comments on all of these. And often they are borrowed or modified versions of orthodox economics. And because that, Keynesian theory was absorbed back into orthodox economics. Became, you know, what John Robinson calls bastard Keynesianism. Perhaps if Keynes lived, I don't know, but he was so involved in so many things, and he was a genius. It's not clear to me. Part of what I've tried to do in the book is show that there's a natural foundation for Keynesian economics in the classical tradition. Because the key variable in Keynesian economics, the key factor in the theory of effective demand, is investment. It's volatile and moves up and down. Well, Keynes says investment depends on two things: expected profitability, which is very volatile, and the interest rate. He focuses on the interest rate. But in the classical tradition, there's a theory of profitability. And you can link expected profitability to that. And then you have a natural foundation for the theory of effective demand in the context of growth and all of that. That's a significant part of the macro section of my book.
Okay. Having said that, thank you very, very much for your time.